Login accepted.
Okay. Oh, wait, is it this one? Oh, it is this one. Okay, wonderful. Everything's working. Sorry for the delay. My car broke down on the 80-mile drive here, and then there's a lot of traffic. But yeah, it's sorry for being late. This week we're going to be going over Windows Defense for CCDC. Um, so hopefully, if you participated in the CPTC meeting this morning, that will give you a bunch of context for the topics we're going to be going over and what we're going to be defending against. And even if you didn't, hopefully it still helps you gain a better understanding of what is important for security in Windows server environments. Yeah, let me share my screen. All right. If you're online and you have a question, uh, please send that in the text chat because I don't have my audio on here, and one of my friends can let me know if there's a question to answer. Uh, Otherwise, yeah, actually, I can't answer your voice at all because I can't hear you. So just send it in the text chat if you want to ask a question. All right. So I forgot to put a picture because I planned to get here 45 minutes early and do that. But I'm Dylan, also known as Mike. I was the secondary Windows person 2 years ago and then team captain last year. And I recently graduated, smiley face. So what we're going to be going over today is first we're going to be going over just navigating the Windows Server environment. It's very different from Linux. It has a lot more GUI components. There's two different command line interfaces that work differently. And then we're going to be going over Active Directory. So specifically what domains are, how they work generally. And we're also going to be covering some ways to interact and manage Active Directory environments. Then we're going to be going over just other services and then finally we'll introduce the lab. All right, navigating. So there's a couple main ways to interact with a Windows server. The first that most people are familiar with because it's very similar to how you interact with your desktop at home is just the GUI. So there's lots of different applications and little management tools and stuff in the Windows Server environment that lets you interact with services and permissions and the Windows domain environment purely through the GUI. It's very beginner friendly. It's generally pretty easy and somewhat intuitive to use. But the downside to it is it's very slow. Like GUI tools take a long time to open up when you open them. They load very quickly. Sometimes it takes a long time to figure out exactly how to do what you want to do through it. So the better solution generally is to use one of the CLI that exist on Windows. So the old one, or here, I'll go over the new one first. The new one is PowerShell. It's a executable like command line interface you have in Windows as well as its own programming language. It's relatively simple. It's a lot quicker to use than the GUI, and it's very extensive for a scripting language, which I'll go over why later. And then finally, the last alternative is command prompt or cmd.exe. It's outdated. It's not supported as much as PowerShell is, but the main benefit to using it is that the commands that you will run on CMD on like a 2025 Windows server are the exact same ones that you'll need to run on a 2012 server to do the same thing. So it's very useful when you have an environment with a bunch of different server versions across the domain. PowerShell, it's really great. It's supported and actively developed by Microsoft. Depending on the Windows Server version you're using, it'll have different versions with maybe different command flags for different commands and PowerShell commandlets that you use. But uh, Yeah, it's very simple because of the verb noun syntax it uses for all the commands. So essentially, every single thing you type into PowerShell is going to start with some sort of verb, whether that's like get, set, invoke. Those are the three main ones, and then the noun will always be whatever you're trying to access, modify, or use. So here's some example nouns there. You can pretty much access anything in Windows as an object. So the great thing about PowerShell is that everything, whether it's user accounts, groups in the Windows domain, information about like the operating system, information about like the hardware, like literally anything you would need to interact with through a script or command line in Windows is an object that you can access through PowerShell. Um, it's really nice integrated with the Windows API. So like I said, you can manage pretty much anything with it. So whether it's users, services, registry keys, etc. And yeah, it's a lot more easier. I would say it's a lot easier to read and understand what it's doing than Bash, and it's also a lot easier to create more complex scripts than Bash because you don't have to worry about individually parsing the output of every single command that you invoke because everything is always returned as an object, structured data that you can use and pass into something else. So some important GUI pains to know for navigating are we'll go over these more in detail shortly, but regedit, which is how you edit registry keys, which pretty much are how you set every setting in a Windows Server environment are set through registry keys. Um, File Explorer, which is navigating the file system. You're definitely familiar with this. Computer management, compmanagement.msc is used to view like shared folders, local users to some extent, scheduled tasks, event viewer. I think those are the main ones. Uh, Services is how you view services in Windows, pretty self-explanatory. Uh, in Windows, services are essentially just executable programs that are set to run and have their execution handled by Windows. So basically, you have some sort of service, let's say you want to run like an SSH server on a Windows, you would have to add it or install it in some way that adds it to the list of registered services. That way, every time you boot up Windows, it can automatically start. You can manage running those services through services.msc, which makes it really simple. And yeah, that's very important to know. Control panel is how you pretty much edit any system settings. So how you change like the IP settings of your server, how you change like accessibility settings, how you change pretty much any of the normal things that you would want to do and customize when interacting with a server. Task Manager is how you view the current running processes. There's some alternatives to Task Manager that are maybe a little bit better, some third-party alternatives that we'll get into in a bit. And then Server Manager is how you manage the main roles and features. So these are like the Microsoft supported services that Windows servers support. So whether that's an Active Directory services, certificate services, mail servers, etc., you can handle that through the Server Manager, generally installing them. And then finally, GP Edit is the group policy editor. It's how you set a lot of the, uh, I guess, permissions or rules for not only your local Windows server, but if it's connected to a domain or it's a domain controller, how you would set the permissions and rules for the entire server environment. So the whole network containing all the Windows servers on it. Registry, the Windows registry is really important. Like I said, it's pretty much how you configure any sort of setting in a Windows environment. Like you can change literally anything. You can set the current language of the server through the registry. You can set uh, what different buttons in the GUI do when you click on them. You can change what they do when you click on them. You can modify pretty much anything through it. Um, it's basically what Windows uses to configure its entire environment. So the really nice thing about it is it can be modified with the CLI. You can, alternatively to opening up what's shown in the picture here, the registry editor, and clicking through and changing those settings manually. If you know where something is and know that you want to change it and have it set a certain way, you can access that directly through the CLI with set item property or other commands that do the same thing. Essentially, how it works is that in the registry, there's a hierarchy. So there's hives which pertain to what users they affect. So local machine affects the entire server, whereas current user settings within current user would only affect the settings for that specific user account that's using that server. And then within though, there's a lot of keys that where you actually specify the different values for the different settings. Um, and one really important thing in terms of defense is that it's very common to set persistence through the Windows registry. There's a lot of different keys that if you give them uh, an executable path as their value, it will automatically execute that program on startup or when a user does something, maybe clicks a certain button, etc. It's a very, very easy way to get persistence for uh, shells or any sort of malware. The file system. Hopefully you know what the file system is if you used a Windows environment before. But the main thing, I guess, that differentiates it from the Linux file system is that the paths are a little different. So all the system binaries and libraries are under System32 in the Windows folder. All the user files are under the users folder, and the different program files are in the different program files folder respective to, I guess, where they belong. So binaries would be in program files, and then like config files would be in program data. Libraries would be in like x80, etc. Uh, the really great thing about the Windows file system compared to Linux is that it has really, really configurable permissions. So it's a big reason why enterprise uses Windows in the first place. You can set a lot more specific permissions per individual users and per groups than you can do with Linux, where you can only set file permissions based on the users and groups that own those files, as opposed to all of them within the file system. Um, a lot of services and files also use something called SDDLs, which we'll touch on lightly. Uh, Computer management is essentially used to audit the normal, I guess, uh, users and services that a Windows server would serve by default. So you can audit, authorize, unauthorized users, enable, disable users. You can set group memberships. You can set what privileges they have through the computer management interface. It's also where you can look at file shares. So you can go and look at all your SMB file shares. There's a couple default ones on Windows servers, like the C file share and sometimes an admin file share. And it's really important to check this if you're auditing a system to make sure there's no weird file shares with weird access permissions that anyone can go and connect to and use, because that's a way that attackers can write data to your system or even just look at sensitive information. And then domain controllers also have a lot more default file shares. So if you open up a Windows server and there's a bunch of weird file shares like sysvol and like a bunch of random stuff, don't immediately assume that those are all not important, because Windows Active Directory needs them to do certain things. So before you delete or do anything with file shares, make sure that it's not a required one for the system. You can also look at scheduled tasks here. Kind of annoying to navigate because you can't really, there's not amazing ways to search for different scheduled tasks, but it's important to check this, especially like recently run tasks within scheduled tasks, because it's another way for attackers to gain persistence. They can essentially set executables, so any arbitrary program to run on a certain condition, whether that's every given time interval, on the start of the server, on execution of some other program. There's lots of different ways that you can set triggers for for launching executables or scheduled tasks. And then event viewer is really important. It's essentially the native built-in system logging of Windows servers. It essentially logs a bunch of different important events that might happen on a system. So for instance, if a user tries to log into an account and they fail that login attempt, they give the wrong password or whatever, it will log that attempt as ID 4625 within the event viewer. You can search for specific events in event viewer. So you can, for instance, only search for failed login attempts. You can only search for like attempted connections on like a certain port. Yeah, really useful for if you don't have any other sort of software for logging for viewing what's going on a Windows Server environment. The services panel is basically how you look at anything that is designed to run in the background and serve some purpose on a Windows server. So some example would be like a file server like FileZilla. That would be a third-party service that you would be able to manage through the services panel. And then like BitLocker is a native sort of Windows service that uh, runs in the background and is just sort of on there by default. So there's two ways to identify services. Their display name, which is the first thing that pops up on the left when you look through the list of services. It's very simple to understand. It's generally pretty explanatory of what the service is. It'll usually say uh like OpenSSH or uh my gosh, man, I'm really tired today. It'll say what it is. The service name, on the other hand, is generally more useful because it's how you access and manage services through the command line. So if you want to run a command to start or stop something, you would use the sh more shorthand name to refer to it internally. Uh, yeah, that's the most important thing for the services panel. And then finally, the control panel. This is sort of just the general system management. This also exists on normal Windows Home like desktop environments. So you might already somewhat be familiar with this, but it's essentially just the central place to manage anything that isn't like Windows Active Directory or like service related. So you can like manage the firewall through it. You can manage remote desktop, which is how you remotely natively log into Windows servers. Um, you can mess with user account controls, which is a little bit different than privileges. It's more like settings, like default settings for when accounts try to do certain privileged actions on Windows, what they're prompted with. So maybe it won't prompt them at all, it'll automatically elevate them to admin, or you can set it so that when they try to do something that requires to be run as administrator, that it prompts you for the password for the admin account. You can also manage network adapters. So this is the place where you would change like the IP for a Windows server. And finally, processes are viewed through Task Manager. This is essentially how you view any running process on a on the server. Um, so anything that is run from an executable file is shown within Task Manager. So this could be apps like Google Chrome, Discord, uh, File Explorer, or like system binaries like WinLogon that are required to run in the background for it to function. Um, you can mostly create and kill processes through Task Manager. Some of them are like Windows processes and need to be there, so it won't let you just kill them through this. Um, but yeah, all the different specifications for what you can and can do through this are here. So like apps, you can terminate them, whereas like background processes and Windows processes, you may not be able to manage through this. So some alternatives to Task Manager are task list or get process, which are command line commands, which you can give arguments to list out certain processes, filter for certain things, like maybe by process ID, maybe by the path of their executable. Lots of different ways you can search for specific processes. And then there's Process Hacker and Process Explorer, which are third-party GUI applications, which are sort of like enhanced versions of Task Manager. They're generally a lot more detailed. They're very similar to each other. The main difference with Process Explorer is that you can automatically scan, do like static scans of the different executables running, and compare those with their signatures on VirusTotal. So if there's any like super obvious, well-known malware running on your system, you can scan it with this and it'll probably find it. And their server manager. You use this to, like I said, install a lot of the Windows like native services. So Active Directory services is the main one. Uh, it's really easy to navigate, like really simple GUI. Also, you can install IIS, which is like the native Windows like type of web server, um, and a bunch of other stuff that you can take a look at later during the lab. Um, It's not super feature rich. There's not really a lot you can do through it other than just install and uninstall some of those services. The main thing is that it has a really nice convenient drop-down menu for you to open things like group policy editor and other stuff if you don't remember the exact name of the tool that you want to use to type into run. Um, but yeah, it's not super feature rich, but it is come automatically in every Windows server, so it is nice to have. Yeah. Windows Defender, Microsoft Defender. Hopefully you're familiar with this. It comes installed on every operating system except Server 2012 by default. And you can uninstall it through the server manager on server editions, unlike Windows Home. Um, so the how effective it is really determined by the server version. Obviously, older versions of Windows Defender are known to not really be useful for anything much. But newer ones have a lot of cool, fancy capabilities, like all these things listed here. So attack surface reduction rules, exploit mitigation, um, really nice automatic like containment of potential malware, really nice quarantining. So it's gotten a lot better recently. It's still not like the end all be all for protecting your system from malicious activity. Um, and there's GP Edit, which is the group policy editor. So we'll talk about group policy a little bit more when we get into Active Directory and Windows domains later. But really, all you have to know for now is it's how you edit the security and general like security relevant system policies for either your local computer, your local server, or the entire Windows domain. So you can edit local group policy for just one specific server, or if you edit it on the domain controller under the domain policy, you can apply these settings universally to every server that's joined to that Windows domain. Windows Firewall is the last main important thing we'll go over. The main thing that you should know about it if you attended the networking and Linux weeks before is that the main difference between this and IP tables on Linux is that the Windows host firewall is automatically stateful, which means you don't have to explicitly allow connections inbound and outbound for the same thing in order for it to work. You can choose to allow connections only outbound or only inbound, which will essentially allow only services, or sorry, only connections that are coming in, like from a external client to your server, to be allowed. Or if you only allow connection for outbound, that means that only that port or application or whatever is allowed to connect outwards. And if something tries to connect to it externally, that connection won't be allowed. So there's two main ways, or I guess three main ways to interact with the Windows firewall. The first is the GUI, very, very user friendly. As you can see here, it's essentially just a list of different rules with all the different settings for each rule. So this is an example of the inbound rules for this Windows server, this photo here. So you can see that at the top, there's a rule to allow TCP 80, which is the port for HTTP. So this rule, as you can see, uh, we'll go over each column really quick. Um, Profile, generally, unless you're managing a pretty complex environment, you just want to apply rules to all profiles. Um, you can look into that specifically if you're interested in that. There's different profiles on Windows servers that manage different things. Um, Enabled is whether the rule is running or not, whether it's actually filtering anything. The action can be either allow or deny, which essentially is specifying whether the traffic is allowed or not for that specific rule. And then program is you can actually set on Windows explicit firewall rules to only allow specific programs. So you could allow an outbound rule only for Google Chrome outbound, and that would allow Google Chrome to connect to websites through ports 80 and 443, but it wouldn't allow any other sort of executable or process or application to make the same connection. It's very useful. Local address and remote address are for if you're restricting connections to or from any specific IP address. Protocols, obviously TCP, UDP, ICMP for paying whatever protocol you want to allow on that port. And then port is or local port, sorry, is the specific local port you're allowing a connection for. Very easy to create and look at and manage your firewall rules through the GUI. And it's probably the most important part of defense for Windows servers because if you have a vulnerability or vulnerable service on your Windows server, it doesn't matter if no one can connect to it. The next way to manage the firewall is through PowerShell. So net firewall rule is the noun that you use in PowerShell to manage the firewall. So there's you can do get net firewall rule to see the list of all firewall rules. You can, in this example, create a new rule with new net firewall rule, and then you have to specify the different properties of that rule, like we just went over. So like the name of the rule, whether it's an inbound or outbound one, whether it allows or blocks something, and you can also specify like remote IP addresses that are allowed. You can specify which port it's on, and so and so. And the final way is also a command line way to interact with the firewall. It's netsh. The good thing about this is that it will work on both PowerShell and CMD because it's not a PowerShell commandlet. It's an actual program that interacts with the firewall. So you can call netsh to essentially do the same things you can do with the previous commandlet, except the one nice thing about it is it has a lot of shorthand, so it's very easy to write really quick, short firewall rules if you're really used to the syntax and are familiar with it. And yeah, that goes over our basic navigation and explanation of Windows servers. So now we're going to talk about Active Directory. Really fun, really exciting. All right. So essentially, what Active Directory is a service that you can install on Windows servers that allows them to connect and authenticate with each other in a way that you can establish hierarchies of rule sets and authentications within a network. So, for instance, your CPP login. How does it work everywhere, and how do you use the same account for everything? All the different services that Cal Poly Pomona uses are under the same Active Directory to some extent. So your authentication, your login on one service, on one server will work for another service on another server, and they'll all be synced to each other. The way that they're generally organized are into first into domains. So a domain is a collection of Windows servers that are all connected to at least one domain controller, which is the central authority for deciding policy and rules for the rest of the Windows domain. So all the other member servers on the domain. You can have more than one domain controller on a Windows domain, but you only need one for it to work. And then a forest is basically just the word to describe like a collection of domains that are connected to each other in some way. So in the example here, you can have like a parent domain, so like nebula.lan in this example, or you can have a child domain under it that is a member of a larger forest with the parent domain nebula.lan that is a subdomain us.nebula.lan, right? So pretty much just a basic like tree, like hierarchical organization. Um, Essentially how it works. So yes, I already explained this. Okay, sorry. Already went over this stuff. So the way that domains work is everything in a domain that is managed by the domain is an object. So you have like organizational units, you have groups, you have users in the domain, you have some other data, and pretty much all of that. The reason for that is that you can manage or access these groups and users in this data from any server in the same standardized way, and it's very useful for, I guess, sharing policies and stuff across different Microsoft servers. LDAP is the way that you query this information. You can do this within a network. You can do an LDAP query from a member server on a network, and you can also do it externally. So you can, if it's not like blocked by a firewall or rules, you can LDAP query a Windows domain from outside of the domain, just from like some random client connecting to it. And essentially, what this does is generally it's required to authenticate to it in some way. And then after you authenticate, you should be able to query any information about any important domain information, like different groups that exist on those domains. So like admins, enterprise admins, domain admins, normal users, etc. Uh, and you can get any information about user membership to those different groups, uh, policy and user membership for different organizational units. And like I said, you can use any LDAP client to query this information. So PowerShell, there's internal Windows tools. You can also do this programmatically from literally any server. Um, yeah, so there's gonna be a little bit of confusion because you do have to authenticate to LDAP in order to get information about like user membership and group membership for uh, getting info about like who can do what in a domain. But it doesn't actually directly handle the authentication itself. Within Windows domains, there's some other protocols, either NTLM or Kerberos, that handles actually verifying whether a user's login information is correct. And then once that's verified, you can then use LDAP in order to query the information that you want. All right. So a couple things you know so far about Windows domains is that once there's a bunch of different servers on a single Windows domain, you can log into any computer, like I said, with the same login information. And also, there are synced policies, security and user policies across all those servers on the domain that automatically update and are proliferated from the domain controller or domain controllers that will then get applied to the entire domain. Um, there's a few different ways this happens. Uh, the way that you apply policy is through gpmc.msc. You do this on a domain controller. It's sort of like the group policy editor that we talked about earlier, except it's how you set specifically the domain policy. So whereas gpedit on a random Windows server would edit the local security policies and user policies and other policies that they have, the domain policy editor on the domain controller will allow you to set policies for all the computers on or all the servers that are joined to the domain. Um, and then there's also a domain controller policy where you can set policies that only apply to domain controllers. And there's like an order of hierarchy to how policy applies. Essentially, like the domain control policy, if it applies to a server, is like the most important, and then the default domain policy comes after that, and then that overrides the local policy if it's different. Um, and the last thing for managing these servers remotely is WinRM. It's enabled by default when you join a domain. So you can basically once you're connected to a server within a Windows domain, you can send commands like through PowerShell to another server within that domain with like no prior sort of authentication because it's assumed that you do because if you're logged in and authenticated to a server on the domain already, it's known that you have domain membership and you have privileges on that domain. Um, it's also possible to enable settings so that you can do this remotely from outside the domain with extra authentication, which can be useful in some cases. Yeah, so PS remoting, like I just said, by default, they'll only accept connections originating within the domain. It's enabled by default, but PS remoting is WinRM is enabled by default, but PS remoting, which is what allows you to connect from outside of a domain, isn't. You can enable it using the command given here. And once that happens, you can then do the same thing, execute like management PowerShell commands from outside of the domain. So from just some random other server that can connect to it, but isn't necessarily a member of it. So the way that servers know who the other servers are on a domain are through domain names. So the way that domain names work and are organized are through something called a domain name system or domain name server, which is really important when it comes to not only understanding how Windows domains work, but understanding how networking and networks and the internet works generally. Essentially, you have a DNS server, which will usually be on a domain controller, where you can attach words or domain names or yeah, like alphabetical addresses to IP addresses. So you can, for instance, set one server's address equal to, uh, let's say you want to set it to like earth.nebula.lan. You want one server to have that domain name. You would go into the nebula.lan domain name system and then create an entry for the domain name Earth with the IP address of that server that you want to name Earth. And then any server that uses the domain's DNS server for its DNS will, if you type in that domain name, will first search the DNS server on the domain to find the IP address that correlates with that domain name, and then it will be able to connect to that server through the IP address. Um, it also forwards, generally forwards any traffic that isn't um, what's it called? It forwards any traffic that isn't asking for a domain name that's listed on the domain's DNS server to whatever external domains name server you might be using. So like the one that most people use is like the Google one, which is 8.8.8. So for instance, if you type in google.com on a domain joined server, obviously like google.com, that server is not within your Windows domain. So that domain name will probably not be in your DNS server, and then it will forward that request to an external one, which will then return to you with the proper IP address. And it uses UDP for queries. TCP is used for some other things, but mostly just UDP. So the DNS server role can be installed on any Windows server. It's installed by default when you make a Windows server a domain controller because it's necessary for the Windows domain to function to have DNS. But you can also install extra DNS servers on other Windows servers on the domain and then use them if you want to. Yeah, so authentication, like I talked about earlier, although LDAP is used for getting like object info about a Windows domain, so information about like groups, users, organizational units, which are used for holding like group policy information. You need to authenticate before you can actually query that information. You need to be able to prove to the Windows domain in some way that you are who you say you are and that you are allowed to interact with those services. So the two main ones are NTLM and Kerberos. So NTLM is used locally on every Windows servers to verify local users. So even once you domain join a Windows to a Windows domain, even if you join a Windows server to a Windows domain, and you can then log into it with your domain user account. It will still have local users that you can still log into just that specific server with, even if they're not domain users. So it's used to do that kind of authentication. It's a network authentication protocol, and it's kind of a little bit outdated at this point. So it's a lot more easily crackable than Kerberos, which we'll go over next. Kerberos is a little bit more secure. It has a little bit better encryption. It also uses the concept of tickets. So the way that it works is that tickets have a given lifetime. So this is how authentication within or between servers in a Windows domain works, is that they give some sort of proof. So like whether that's like a user login or some sort of inter-system authentication. Essentially, Kerberos takes some sort of proof that you have a right to access an account with certain privileges on the domain. And then once it's gotten that proof, it gives you a ticket, which has a specific arbitrary given lifetime. Um, and then once you have that ticket, which is derived from whatever user password and the Curb TGT account password through some cryptographic method, once you have that, you can then connect and that domain will trust you for that given amount of time without having to re-give it those credentials every time you want to do something. So here's a pretty here's a decently thorough visual of how that authentication works, as well as a fun little I guess analogy if you don't quite get it yet or understand exactly how it works. It's similar to like when you go to a concert, you show once you like show them your ticket, which is like your authentication method, like your proof. you would then get a wristband. And then as you're going around the concert or event or fair or whatever you're going around, the fact that you have that wristband, which in this analogy would be the ticket that Kerberos gives you, proves that you're allowed to do all the things at that fair or that event or whatever you're at. Um, in the same way that once you authenticate to Kerberos, you have a ticket that allows you to continue using the services that you should be able to use for as long as the ticket lasts. So now we're going to talk a little bit about service security descriptors. This can get into pretty complex topics because the actual format of service security descriptors are really long and complicated. Windows has really, 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 really granular controls for access to different Active Directory objects. But basically, every AD object has some sort of security descriptor, whether it's like a user, a group, shared folder, printers, services. And those security descriptors hold information such as who owns that thing. So the unique value assigned to the account group who owns that specific service or object or whatever. And then you also have a access control list, which identifies who is allowed to access or not allowed to access the server, the service or object or whatever. And then you also have a system access control list, um, which allows like logging agents, like administrators, to log attempts to use that service on some sort of logging system. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the discretionary access control list. The reason it's so complicated is it doesn't just say who's allowed to uh, access a service. It gets really granular. It can be who's allowed to modify a service, who's allowed to start a service, who's allowed to stop a service, and the actual syntax of these security descriptors, which you can get through PowerShell if you want to do so. You can look at them, is basically just a letter with a bunch of like delimiters and then like a bunch of random characters that correlate with the different descriptors of the security um, access for that service. So now we're going to talk a little bit about other Windows services. So file transfer protocol. Um, Probably went over this during Linux, but FTP, it runs on port 21 and 20 generally. Passive mode is horrible because the client side decides what port to do the data transfer on, which sucks because it can require like any random port above a certain range to work properly. Really not fun for doing firewalls. Um, which is why on Windows, the application level firewall policies are kind of nice. And FTP clients natively exist on pretty much every OS. So if you type FTP in the CLI, you should be able to connect to an FTP server. But if you want on your Windows server to actually install a FTP file server, you can actually do that through the server manager, or you can install a third-party one um, that you would rather prefer. SMB is very common on Windows. It's used in Active Directory. Every Windows server has SMB shares on it by default. It stands for Server Message Block. It's essentially a way to just connect to file systems on their computers. It's the way that like if you're at work or home and you have like a shared like Windows like storage that appears as like another Windows drive or folder within your desktop, but it's actually on some other computer that uses SMB. Um, so there's some fun APIs that are exposed during SMB connections that allow attackers to do some very malicious things that you don't want them to be able to do. So it's generally good on your server to make sure if you do need an SMB service running in some capacity to make sure it's as updated as possible. So it's not like an old version that's, for instance, vulnerable to Eternal Blue. Um, and generally make sure you don't have like random file shares with bad permissions because those are really easily exploitable as well. Oh yeah, it's also how PS exec works, which is actually a very useful tool for elevating a command prompt in Windows or a PowerShell session in Windows uh, to use the system account instead of like the admin account. So usually if you like right click on PowerShell and you run as admin, that's like the most elevated you can get with this really handy tool called psexec, which uses SMB actually do this elevation. You can elevate a PowerShell session to run a system, so you're even above admin, and you can essentially do things exactly as the computer or the Windows server itself would do them. IIS or Internet Information Services is the web server that's built into Windows. Once again, you can install it directly through Server Manager through adding a role. It supports .NET out of the box. You can also add PHP or other scripts to it. It's very plain and boring. It doesn't really do anything out of the box. Um, Not my favorite web server. Kind of complicated to interact with. The IIS Server Manager GUI really, really, really is not fun to use. Um, but it's important to get familiar with, especially in the context of CCDC or just running or just like Windows servers in general, because there are lots of web servers that will use IIS. XAMPP is my preferred web server on Windows. Um, It's sort of like LAMP on Linux. It's a installation of all the different general parts of a web framework that you would generally need for a web app. So it has the web server to serve your actual application, HTTP. It has a MySQL server to host a database for that application. It comes with a FileZilla server for FTP for hosting files for that web server. And then it also comes with Apache. Um, and there's also Tomcat, which is Apache, but it's written in Java. And I don't know who wrote this slide, actually. This is an older slide, but apparently they really don't like Java because they said Tomcat is Apache, but worse. The content management system, CMS, pertains to actual like applications that run on the framework. So you have like a XAMPP or like IIS, like web server or web stack. Content management system applies to like the actual services that are being hosted on those servers. So like could be like WordPress, it could be like a Wikipedia. These are very commonly seen in CCDC, where you'll have blogs, maybe shops, like commerce sites, or just like static pages with information on them that are relevant to the competition in some way or being scored. Um, these all kind of set up and work the same. HTTP hosts the actual web server files. There's some sort of scripting engine in the back end, so like .NET, PHP, whatever, that processes the back end logic for actually delivering content, handling like user authentication, etc. And then like some sort of database that stores long-term information. So like user information, like posts that should be able to be accessed like after you close the web application and come back to it. Um, So the CMS files are generally put in the webroot folder. And then obviously these are just essentially at the bottom of this slide, the steps to set up a web application. So you would set up database credentials in the config file. You would set up the database in the MySQL server, the MySQL GUI, or however you access it. And then you would browse to localhost to access that web server locally, or if you have a domain name assigned to the IP address of the server that you're running it on, you could access it through that domain name, or you could just access it directly through the IP address of the server. All right. So before we get to homework, actually, I'm gonna wait and see if anyone has any questions. Let me open up the chat. Sorry, I'll go through and answer the questions that have been asked, if there are any. Oh. What's a registry key? Okay, I don't know if you asked this before I went over it, but I'll explain it one more time. Um, a registry key is essentially just like a data structure, I guess, in the most like abstract terms, that holds information relevant to the Windows like operating system or Windows services in some way. If we go back to the file in it, so I can give you like a visual explanation. It's organized in like registry keys are organized in like a tree hierarchy. So, like I said, there's these hives which essentially all the registry keys under them only pertain to that like group of people or that like hive of like use of that server. So like the H key local machine hive affects the entire like stuff that's relevant to the entire server. So regardless of what like user you're using. And then like the current user hive, for instance, would affect only settings for that specific user that's currently authenticated to that server. Within those hives, there's keys that are organized in like a hierarchical structure. Um, and within those keys, each of those keys can hold one or more like name value pairs. So within a key, for instance, I'll go over like the common persistence one. Within H key local machine, I think it's the key is like H key local machine, software, and then Microsoft, and then Windows, and then there's a key called, and then like current something. There's a key called run, which every single like name value pair in run pertains to an application that the operating system will automatically boot on startup. So within that run key, if you have like on the side a key named, I don't know, like uh, let's say you don't have a web server registered as a service and you want to run it through the run key for some reason. You could put, for instance, Apache, um, or you want to do like a file server, you could put like FTP, and then the actual executable that you want to execute for that service to run, you would put as the value for that like name value pair within that key. And then every time the server turned on, it would launch that executable immediately on boot. Um, for some things like the run key, common persistence method, the name of the like name value pairs doesn't really matter. You can pretty much name them anything as long as the value is like the path to the executable that you want to launch. For some other keys where you're setting like specific settings for specific services or applications. So I'm not super familiar with the Photoshop keys, but I'd assume here the plugin path name value pair um, needs to be have the name plugin path in order for Photoshop to know that this path given in the data section of that like name data pair is the path that should be used for accessing plugins. So in some cases, the name for these pairs within keys do matter, and in some cases they don't. And I guess now if anyone has any questions, this would be the best time to ask. Why would anyone use IIS if it's just easier to set up to manage a XAMPP server? Um, I guess just preference. I guess people just prefer it. I don't personally prefer it. I don't really know why, honestly, why people would prefer it. It is very easy to set up and install because you just go into the Windows Server Manager and you click install IIS and you have a web server with a working .NET backend automatically. Um, but if you want to do anything that isn't like supported by just having a web server and like that backend, it is kind of a pain to do anything else with it. That's also true. Like a lot of people, another reason why it's important to know about this, regardless of whether or not it's like your personal preference to do things, like Luke just said, is that lots of people do use IIS services or IIS servers in order to host web services. So it's important to be familiar with it and have a good idea, not only for CCDC, because there are commonly like IIS services within the competitions, but also just for your like career. They're pretty commonly used as a web server. Any other questions that I can try to answer? All right, I'm gonna keep this meeting chat uh, window open. So if anyone has any questions for the next short while, I'll be able to answer them. Um, but otherwise, This is the link to your homework for this week. I can really quickly go over it. Dude, Zoom interface is not being kind to me. Okay, so the assignment for this week, which was just sent in the meeting chat as well, there's two parts. The first is a Windows Try Hack Me room that should, for the most part, just get you familiar with navigating a Windows server, mostly through the GUI and some of the common GUI services and tools that we just talked about during this meeting. Um, Once again, you have to, for all the different sections and questions on it, you should not just complete it and submit proof of your completion, but you should also submit proof of your process and document what you're doing to solve the different challenges and questions during it. And the second part is a Windows lab hosted on the student data center. So access it the same way you've accessed previous labs. You have to connect to the VPN using your account, and then you go to Camino, log into that with your SDC domain account, and then clone the CCDC Windows template. That's the template for this week. There are two Windows VMs. The creds are the same for both. They're given right here. It's just administrator and then CCDC 2025 exclamation mark for the password. And then you just have to answer and document your process for solving and answering all of these questions. So there's all of these, I think, um, should be doable, given the information we've got on today, questions 3 through 6. I was really excited for question 7 because I think it's fun and interesting, but I was told by some people that it might be a little difficult. So I decided to make it worth like bonus. So only do it if you want a little bit of a challenge, unless you're already pretty familiar with Windows. So basically on the domain controller, the DNS service, which as we went over during this meeting, is very important for Windows Active Directory to function properly and for a domain to work, is not working. The service is just not on. It like won't start. So the bonus challenge for this is to figure out why and explain how you fix it. And then after you just deliver the documentation for both the Try Hack Me room and this and the lab, and that is it for this week. Any questions about the homework? All right. I don't see any, but I'm gonna hang out here for probably at least 15 more minutes, 15, 30 more minutes, and wait and see if anyone has any questions. So feel free to stick around in case you have any questions as you start the homework or anything pops into your head. And yeah, thank you for coming to the workshop today. Hope you learned something.